Most parents don't realize that their child is on the path to failure until it's too late. Now, if your child is showing any of these 5 signs, they could be at serious risk of failing the exams. But the good news is that you can turn it around if you act early. Let's dive in. For those of you who are new to the channel, hi, I'm Varjod. I'm the founder of Mobile Tutors, and every year we help thousands of students increase their GCSE and A-level grades. I scored 98% in most of my GCSE and A-levels, and I hold a first-class degree from the London School of Economics in Business, Maths and Statistics. So let's get into it. So firstly, we have overconfidence, the silent trap. Now, overconfidence is a silent trap because many students believe they've understood a topic simply because they've attended one lesson or just skimmed through the textbook. So this false sense of security means that students actually underestimate how much work is really needed to understand a topic. Now, a lot of students will end up just revising less and sometimes believing that they can just figure out things along the way. But when these students are faced with tricky and challenging questions in the exam, their lack of depth shows and they end up losing easy marks they shouldn't. Now, after teaching thousands of students every year, I can confidently tell you this is one of the key reasons why many students fail or don't get the marks they should. Some students avoid practicing certain topics entirely because they think it's too easy and they want to move on to something harder. Some of these students even want to be moved into harder classes to cover harder things, but when it comes to the time of the exam, they can't even get the fundamentals right and end up losing out a lot of marks. Now, the key here is to not skip the fundamentals and make sure you go over everything properly. If your child is skipping the fundamentals and not revising, or they're telling you the stuff is too easy, the chances are they're overconfident and they're not being pushed enough, both of which are problems. So what's the solution? You should get your child to do an honest self-assessment with no shortcuts and no overestimation. But what's the best way of doing this? So what you want to do is get your child to do past papers or exam questions by topic under time pressure. So not only can they recall the content, but they can also work under time pressure. And my advice is to do the past papers early. So if your child is in year 8 or 9 or even year 7, they can go ahead and do a foundation paper from GCSE. And if your child is in year 10 or 11, have them do the higher paper. So this way you can see where their gaps lie, and if they do find things too easy and are overconfident, they can see that they still have a lot to learn. And even if your child is getting most of the questions right, remind them to not be complacent. Remember, even easy topics have hard questions. So make sure your child is humble, they're sharp, and they keep practicing to make sure they can always get 100%. The more questions that your child does and the more practice they do, they'll realize that there are actually topics that they need help with or certain questions they struggle with. So this way they can actually focus on these areas. The key here is to remember that overconfidence will mean that your child will end up revising less, which will mean ultimately they'll get lower than expected results. So secondly, poor time management. This is another reason why a lot of students fail. Those with poor time management end up leaving revision to the last minute, cramming the night before, or just skipping studying. Last minute cramming leads to stress, a shallow understanding, and missed opportunities for deeper revision with improvement over time. Now, time management isn't just about meeting deadlines, it's about having a consistent structure that allows you to learn without pressure piling up. We encourage all of our year 10 students to complete the GCSE content ahead of time, so ideally before the start of year 11. This is so that we can use year 11 just for revision, past papers and exam technique instead of learning new content. But this strategy will only work if your child can manage their time, stay consistent and avoid cramming. Now, one key way that you can tell your child has poor time management is that if they're doing their homework at the last minute. Now, from our experience, students who always hand in their homework late or do it at the last minute are always the ones who perform worse. Now, I'm not saying that if your child hands in their homework late or does it late that they will fail, but if they do it ahead of time, they'll always stay on top of things and will actually perform better. This is because they'll have the right habits and the right attitude towards learning. So what's the solution? Well, you should have your child prioritize their workload earlier on in term. Now, what this means is breaking down the content into manageable chunks and having a consistent study routine. And make sure your child has the right habits of doing their homework on time. This will build the correct attitude, and remember, the more work they do now, the less stress they'll have later. It's important to note that even 30 minutes a day of revision is better than doing 6 hours the night before an exam. And it's always best to stay ahead because you buy yourself time. Now, we have this happen a lot, but a lot of students, they get ill or they miss school. But if you're always ahead of time, then what happens is if something does happen, your child wouldn't have much to catch up on. So thirdly, parental involvement. Now, when parents are not involved actively in their child's education, students often feel that school isn't that important anymore. They don't have anyone who's celebrating their efforts, checking in with them, or even holding them accountable. If as a parent you haven't got any idea of what your child is studying or how important the upcoming exams are, then how can you expect your child to do the same? Because at the end of the day, they are just still children. This disconnect can lead to a drop in motivation from your child, missed warning signs, and perhaps even the most damaging, that your child thinks that they're on their own when it comes to their academic success. So what's the solution? Well, parents don't need to micromanage their children. In fact, too much pressure can be counterproductive, but regular check-ins, honest conversations, and a supportive study environment can make a huge difference. Now, of course, the basics still hold. Parents should always attend their child's parents' evening and have a copy of all of their reports. I often speak to hundreds of parents, and when I ask them for their child's grade, they haven't even got a copy of the report. How can you know if your child is making any progress if you haven't even got the report? You don't need to force your child to study, and in fact, forcing your child to study can be counterproductive, but what you should do as a parent is explain the long-term benefits to your child. The fact that if they put the work in now, they'll have less stress and better choices later on. As a parent, you can simply start by asking your child some basic questions, like how are they feeling with their subjects right now? Have their grades gone up or down? And are they actually struggling with anything? And parents, don't be afraid to speak to your child's teachers, as they often spot things that your child might not share at home. Now, one of the common reasons why a lot of students fall behind is surprisingly simple, and that is that they don't actually ask for help when they need it. Whether it's the fear of looking stupid in front of their friends, or a lack of confidence, or maybe not even knowing who to ask, a lot of students remain silent even when they're lost. Now, the key here is that this confusion doesn't go away on its own. Until your child doesn't ask and understand what's going on, this will actually get worse over time because they're waiting, and the more they wait, more content would have been covered that they don't understand. So what's the solution? Well, start by creating an open and safe environment where your child can ask questions without no shame or no judgment. And let your child know that asking questions isn't weakness, but in fact is actually smart. As a parent, you can also do the following. So firstly, encourage your child to communicate regularly with their teachers, whether this means asking questions in class or maybe a bit of time after school. Also make sure that your child attends any interventions or revision classes that the school offers. Now, you can also encourage your child to study with their peers, because sometimes another student explaining something to your child can be much easier for them to pick up. And if your child is still struggling, then consider getting a private tutor. A good tutor will create a safe environment for your child to ask questions, fill in the gaps, but also get them ahead of the curriculum. Remember, the earlier you start, everything becomes easier. And lastly, let's talk about distractions, especially from devices and social media. The average student gets interrupted dozens of times during a single study session. Now, this leads to shallow focus, poor attention, and hours spent studying without learning much at all. You've probably seen this before, but your child has their book open and a phone in one hand, and half of their brain is on the book and the other half is on the phone, maybe on TikTok or playing a game. Now, the truth is you're actually better off doing one of these things at a time. Doing both of them just wastes time. Either you work and study, or you take a break and you go on social media. Don't mix the two together. So what's the solution? Well, help your child build distraction-free study habits. So you should set specific times when the phones are away. Even 30 or 45 minutes of studying solid without any distractions is great. You can also use app blockers or a do not disturb mode on your phone. And lastly, create a study environment that is quiet and tech-free so you don't get distracted. So let's quickly go over the 5 key warning signs. So firstly, we have overconfidence, thinking you've mastered a topic without properly practicing it. This will lead to under-preparation and losing costly marks in the exam. Now, next we have poor time management, leaving things to the last minute, cramming, and not having a consistent study routine. And thirdly, we have the lack of parental involvement. When parents aren't actively engaged in their child's education, students start to think that school isn't important anymore. And next we have not asking for help, when your child is struggling in silence and not reaching out for support when they're confused. And lastly, we have distractions and social media, when phones and apps constantly interrupt your child, making study time unproductive. Now remember, these signs don't mean it's too late, they're just signals. And with the right support, habits, and environment, any student can turn things around and succeed. If you found this video useful, please give it a like, comment below, and subscribe, and consider sharing it with some friends.